Hi guys, see a few familiar faces here, some that were in my cohort when I went through the Startup Ignition boot camp. Grateful to be here. I'll give you a little background on who I am. I studied advertising at BYU and immediately went to an agency in northern Utah called Thomas Arts. Was there for a couple years and then got recruited to go down to this tiny agency in St. George, Utah that had 3 people. And it's funny because the room when you walked in was super nice. And so I was like, oh man, these guys kind of have it together. And what I didn't find out until I actually started on my first day is that everything outside of that main room was like super run down. It was like a basement, but it worked out. I worked for that company for 5 years. And actually had the opportunity to purchase that company from the previous owner. We were able to grow it quite a bit, moved the headquarters up here to northern Utah. Unfortunately, I didn't have John at the time to tell me how unscalable an agency model was, and maybe I could have been in the SaaS startup world had I met John a little bit sooner. But like I said, I appreciate the opportunity to be here. The reason I'm here is because I want to talk about a fundamental shift that's happened in the marketing world that I think is really important for all of you if you want to, from a marketing perspective, build a sustainable brand and build a company that's going to be able to continuously generate new opportunities for the long term. And I kind of learned a lot of this the hard way. When we moved the headquarters of the company up here to northern Utah from St. George, we rebranded it from Sorensen Advertising, which was the previous owner's name, to Relic, and we decided actually to go all in on tourism. And so we work with tourism destinations all over the country under the Relic brand. This is why it was complicated when John asked me what company I'm from. And then in 2020, we had the opportunity to buy a company called EKR. Many of you may be familiar with EKR. It's been around Utah County for about 20 years. And when we bought EKR, so we had Relic that's focused on tourism, EKR that's been working with a variety of different brand types for years, including some of the local universities, a lot of work with the LDS Church, and then a lot of work with startups and things like that in the Utah community. And that's how we got introduced to John and Tyler at Startup Ignition. But we actually are making a major change in our organization. One, we're bringing these 2 brands together into one, and you guys are actually the first group that's going to, we're launching our new brand on January 1st. But I didn't want to present to you guys and have the brands be completely obsolete in 3 weeks. So we're rebranding to brand Revolt, and our focus is building audiences through owned media. And the reason we're rebranding this way is because of the fundamental shift that we've talked about. That's really kind of the end of what I'm going to talk about with our business, and I really want to focus on this shift that's taken place. We have seen, and if any of you want to get a copy of my slides, I'm sure John and Tyler will send them out too. In trying to help organizations build their businesses for the last 12 or 13 years, in the last 2 years, there's been a really accelerated shift. And I want to look at what a lot of you are doing from a SaaS perspective, because the model is very consistent with what I've seen. Demand generation is obviously a really popular term when we're talking about building a SaaS business. And then a lot of you, as you grow, will hire SDRs, BDRs, salespeople. And I, as a business owner who a lot of SaaS companies want to sell to, I see exactly what that process is and how kind of painful it is for the potential client. And so I get hit up by probably 5 SDRs a week. I know the cadence. I know the emails one day, LinkedIn's another day, phone call another day, voicemail another day. And it's a very transactional approach. And the fundamental shift that has taken place is that customers are expecting more value than just the fact that you were willing to pay to be in front of them in order for them to transact with you. And so when we talk about building a brand that's going to be sustainable for the future, if you approach marketing the way that it's been done for the last 20 years, you're going to be building a brand that's optimized for the past instead of the future. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the major brands that you guys are aware of today. So Gatorade, Kleenex, Disney, a lot of these brands, when they came and kind of owned the marketplace, they really launched at a time when you could buy 2 or 3 different media channels, TV, radio, and you could reach a massive percentage of the market. And of course, over the last 20 years, the media landscape has become fragmented exponentially, right? Customers have options, and so many options that the idea that we're going to be able to use a paid media strategy like a lot of these businesses did to get started, it's kind of a losing battle. The other thing that I'll say is with these media strategies that a lot of organizations are using, your budget determines your ability to compete. And as a startup, you're trying to challenge the incumbent, and the idea that you're going to actually be able to leverage paid media in such a way that the incumbent can't outspend you is a little bit crazy and probably scary to some of the investors that are investing with your business. And so I talked a little bit about yesterday, or about how people used to market with the limited media channels. It was a paid media-centric strategy. A lot of people like to use a creative headline and image and then version that across multiple media channels and really hope that that's going to convert. And then of course you have an earned, owned, and shared plan as well. What I see working right now in the marketplace is putting owned media at the center of your strategy and using that to power paid, earned, and shared media opportunities. And we look at it as a 3-step process: content first, then build a community, and then try to influence commerce. And one of the things that I think is really important here is a lot of us try to just skip to commerce, and with the shift that's taken place in consumer behavior, it's not working. There's diminishing returns. So in 2019, one of the things we were having a problem with was we were doing a really good job in tourism on the Relic side of the business, and we had really taken over a lot of the tourism destinations in Utah and were handling their marketing. But when we tried to scale outside of Utah, we thought it was going to be just as easy to scale outside of Utah as it had been to grow inside of Utah. And all of a sudden we found competitors we didn't know existed, and we found that it was a much more relationship-based business than we thought, and had a really difficult time scaling outside of Utah. So I had the idea in 2019 to start a podcast, and when I started that it's called the Destination Marketing Podcast. When I started it, it was really just like a credibility piece, so that when we responded to an RFP, request for proposal, I'm not sure who knows what here, but when we would respond to an RFP, we would be a finalist, but then it would be really difficult for us to beat the local agency that was there next to the destination. So again, trying to scale outside of Utah, really hard. And then this podcast evolved into something that I never thought it would. It's now the largest podcast in the destination marketing industry. There's only 25,000 destination marketers in the world, and we have 140,000 downloads on that podcast. And the cool thing about that is my strategy was an interview format where I would go find really smart people who are well regarded in the industry and bring them on and ask them about the brilliant things that they're doing and ask them to share their strategies with us. And you know, one of the byproducts of that is I got way smarter, way faster just by asking all these super smart people questions. But guess who my biggest clients are now? It's people that started as guests on my show that I built a relationship with, and then over time they became clients of our agency. One of those was Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. And with Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, I actually shared with this guy. His name's Stuart Butler. He's the CMO of Visit Myrtle Beach. As we were talking, I told him that I was thinking about, I was observing some of these shifts in consumer behavior that were happening, and that we were thinking about pivoting our agency to, instead of being a paid media-centric model, to focus on building content that could then build a community around a brand. And he said, yeah, I think that sounds like a good idea. And then 2 weeks later, he called and asked if we wanted to be his agency of record for all owned media-related activities, and quickly became our biggest client. And so we've been able to do some really cool stuff with them. I'll actually be able to show one of the things that we've done for them today. But anyway, what I'm trying to illustrate is by accidentally getting into this strategy and starting a podcast that I thought was just going to be a credibility piece, it ended up being a complete game changer for my business and really started to change the way I looked at marketing as a whole. So we now have gotten into, and again, this is on the tourism side, we've gotten into, and by the way, if there's any formatting issues here, I accidentally sent Tyler a PDF that I had converted from Google Slides, only for him to convert that PDF back to Google Slides. So I should have asked a few more questions on the front end there. So if there's any formatting issues, I'm sorry there. But we work with about 20 different destinations now in helping them create podcasts, YouTube series, a variety of different show types for them to build a core asset, which is, we call it a content pillar, and then use that asset to power all of their different marketing activities. I don't know everybody's familiarity with the 4 different types of media, so I'm just going to walk through it really briefly. But if you're going to be running a business, and especially if marketing is going to be a part of what you do, you have to understand these 4 different types of media. Number 1 is paid media. And paid media is essentially you are renting access to an audience that someone else already did the work to build. And as soon as you spend that money, it's gone. In 2022, in Q4, how many of you listen to the All In podcast? Okay, if you don't, you should, especially if you're in startups. I actually got to go to the All In podcast summit this year, and it was pretty cool. It was like, anyway, I was a total fanboy at that thing this year. But the All In podcast, one of the things that I heard on there that was really fascinating to me is in 2022 in Q4, Salesforce, because they're a public company, they have to report on a lot of their numbers and metrics and things like that. And their cost to acquire a customer just in fourth quarter of 2022 went up by 75%. And that's because they have a very paid media-centric strategy, and the landscape had really started to shift at that time. And so the challenge with paid media is it's inherently inflationary, so the costs continue to go up every year. And again, in order to make a splash in the marketplace, you have to outspend your competitors, which is nearly impossible. And then, there's different types of paid media that I'm sure you guys are aware of, but the big highlight for me is it's a very transactional relationship. I run the ad, and I ask you to go make a purchase. And that's a lot to ask. And in some of my presentations, I say it's like getting married, asking them to get married on the first date, which in Provo isn't terribly unpopular, but outside of Utah, that really, that resonates. So earned media is essentially public relations, where you're earning the opportunity to be featured on someone else's platform. I don't want to get too into like the election here, but I will say earned media was the core strategy for the Trump campaign in the last 30 days. Now, I don't have the data yet to say that specifically was what put him over the edge, but I can say it wasn't a mistake if they spent their last 30 days that way and they were able to get a victory from that. And one of the things that is a new form of earned media is podcasts, because historically it was like, okay, I need the New York Times to do a write-up on me, or I need the Salt Lake Tribune to cover my company, or Utah Business or whatever. Podcast is a whole new media landscape. And you earn your way on to have a conversation with them, and it really allows you to build a relationship with the audience. So shared media. Shared media is where you own the content, but the platform owns the technology. So this is like your organic social platforms, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and so forth, X. So that's shared media is another really important component. But again, if you're operating all of these in a silo, you are doing the same work 3, 4, 5 times, when in reality, if you start with an owned media asset or a content pillar, you can use it to power everything else that you do. And then owned media I would classify as anything that you truly have ownership of. Now, a YouTube channel, I think that also could fall into the shared media category as well if you want to get specific. But this is where you can create those content pillars: podcasts, video series. We actually executed on a streaming series for Myrtle Beach that turned out to be really, really cool. Your website and email marketing are probably the 2 most underutilized forms of owned media that people neglect a little bit, especially in a startup. With owned media, you get the opportunity to own the audience. And I think this one-to-one relationship with an audience is really where things are going. The ability to have them feel like they have a relationship with you. When I go to, I speak at destination marketing conferences all over the country, and it's funny because I'll have people come up to me and say, like, they start the conversation as if we've already done the small talk. I don't know if that makes sense, but they know who my kids are. For my 300th episode, I actually brought my daughter on and had her interview me to celebrate 300 episodes. And I had people come up and they're like, oh man, Millie did a great job in that episode. And it's like a little uncomfortable that they know my kids' names, you know, but that's the relationship that you're building by creating content on an ongoing basis. And if you own your audience, you actually have the ability to control your future. And at a time, I don't know how many of you have friends or connections that were completely dependent on Facebook for a long time early on. And then when Facebook changed their algorithm and killed some of the organic stuff that businesses were doing, they were just like dead. And that's the danger of being beholden to somebody else for your communication with your current and potential customers. So I really feel like there's a lot of major benefits to using owned media. I really look at it as hunting versus farming, okay? So let's just pretend for a second zombie apocalypse happened, right? I'm out in the wilderness trying to feed my family. I have two options. I can hunt or I can farm. If I go get a deer, kill it, bring it back, cook it, whatever, I'm good for 3 days, but then what do I have to do 3 days later? I got to go hunt again, right? And so many startups have a hunting mentality, and I think it's incredible. Like that's what makes you guys so scrappy is you want to go hunt constantly, right? Farming's a little bit different. It's going to take a lot more work. I'm going to have to till the earth. I'm going to have to plant the seeds, water. It takes several months. But if I do a good job, I actually get to fill my silos for the entire winter. And putting owned media at the center of what you do, it's a longer game, it's a longer play, but you actually, if you do it right, you'll have the opportunity to be able to feed your business for a very long time. And that's what I'm trying to encourage everybody that I talk to do, is to, instead of just using this paid media-centric strategy that is essentially throwing 95% of your money down the drain, build content that builds a relationship with your customer, and then use paid media as a tool to distribute that content. So I'm going to give you a couple real-world examples. How many of you are familiar with Reese Witherspoon's Hello Sunshine company? Okay, one, good. Well, she has millions of people in her audience, but this room isn't as represented by her audience as you'd find in a lot of places, because very, very popular with a female audience for sure. Her audience definitely skews more female. But Reese Witherspoon started a book club, and it was very simple. She just did a book a month, and the audience would kind of come along with her. And as she built this book club, she started to recognize that the audience was getting so... Oh, sorry about that. Okay, hey. John's telling me I was holding it too far from my mouth, so sorry about that. But the audience was getting so big that when she would feature a book, it guaranteed the success of the book. And so she's like, man, maybe I could start a production company and start making movies out of some of these books. She did that. And she actually just sold that production company, book club, everything all in, I think for somewhere near $1 billion. And it's insane. And it all started with building an audience. The next example I'll give you, there's states where I can't use this example, but I'll use it here in Utah. So Jeremy's Razors. How many of you are familiar with the Daily Wire? Conservative creator platform where they brought in a whole bunch of conservative show hosts like Ben Shapiro. At one time they had Candace Owens. They had like a really weird breakup. And several other creators like Matt Walsh. And they built the largest audience of conservative Republicans that was out there. And one of their advertisers on their platform was Harry's Razors. And Harry's Razors was spending quite a bit of money to sponsor the shows. But inevitably, one of those talk show hosts said something that either offended Harry's Razors or someone in their organization, and they decided to pull all their ad spend. Instead of going and finding a replacement advertiser, they started their own razor company called Jeremy's Razors. And in the first 3 weeks, they sold 26,000 subscriptions. And if I don't know exactly what their cost is, but let's say it's $15 a month. We're talking millions of dollars that they generated, way more than Harry's could have been spending as an advertiser on the platform. And now they've got a sustainable brand for the long term. Prime, how many of you are familiar with Prime? For 25 years, Gatorade was the #1 selling sports drink in Walmart. In 3 years, Prime unseated Gatorade as the #1 selling sports drink in Walmart because they had built-in distribution with their audience. This is the change in consumer behavior that I'm talking about. If you add value to your audience in the form of education or entertainment through content, then when you launch products, you have built-in distribution. And that's a really, really great example, I think, of building an audience. And now they'll even watch like dumb fights where you see Mike Tyson in a thong, because they're part of their audience. If you didn't see it, don't Google it. This is a project we had the opportunity to be involved in. Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, I mentioned they're one of our clients. They recognized that 87% of families that have a child on the spectrum don't travel, okay? And when they saw that, for one, they wanted to change that as a tourism destination. But for two, if you do the math, that's 75 million unactivated travelers that they wanted to reach, right? So yes, there's an altruistic case, but there's also a business case for what they did here. They got the destination autism certified and trained their stakeholders to be prepared to receive families that have a child with autism. And then they brought in this series, or this TV show, where they brought 3 families into the destination. They gave them incredible experiences and documented the whole thing. And when they documented the whole thing, they created a 6-episode reality series. And when they created this reality series, they were having a hard time getting the traction on it that they wanted. So they hired us to help them take this asset, this pillar, and slice it up and distribute it into a variety of different channels and use that to generate use that to build an audience around the show. Well, I lost my train of thought there. Sorry, I looked at the clock. I need to speed it up, don't I, John? So they built an audience around the show, and with less than $10,000 of ad spend, we got over 1 million views on the trailer. They were able to take that trailer to streaming platforms, created a bidding war between streaming platforms, and it's going to be available on December 12th on Peacock. There is no amount of media spend that can get you distribution on Peacock, but creating incredible content led them to be able to now get Myrtle Beach in front of millions of people on Peacock. I would encourage each of you to think of your organization not as a product company, but as a media company. The thing that makes you different than your incumbent competitors is the story, is that you're a startup, is that you're taking a risk. So document that. Document every step of the way. How many of you have ever listened to the podcast, I think it is Startup. Gimbal is the company. Have any of you listened to that? So he actually started even recording his investor meetings before he launched and said, I'm starting this company. Here's my pitch, will you invest? And he recorded the no's. People told him no. So the first several episodes of the podcast are just him asking for money. And then he documents, he finally got funded, he starts building the company, he documents the whole way through. Gimbal is worth an incredible amount of money now. He's got several podcast properties and has really built an incredible audience. I'm not going to go through the rest of my slides because I want to make sure that I'm doing well on time. But if you take nothing else away from this, use content to build a relationship with your audience. And if you do that, it's much more sustainable for the long term than a paid media strategy where you're going to waste your investors' money trying to hunt all the time. At some point, there's a breaking point, and you've got to own access to the audience, and you can only do that through creating incredible content. It doesn't need to be high-value production. You don't need to bring in a major studio. Just document your journey and share it publicly, and you'll see those results for a long time. Thank you.